Hey, good day. I'm Andy Carmichael, Senior Geologist at IsoEnergy. Welcome to IsoEnergy's Hurricane Zone presentation for AME Roundup, January 2021. First, a few legal notes. Next, a word on our approach. Our CEO, Craig Perry, often says it's the size of the prize, the cost of the test, and the chance of success that are the key factors in exploration. We believe discovery in the Athabasca offers a huge prize in a low-cost jurisdiction, and ISO leverages 35 plus years of combined uranium experience to ensure the best targets are tested to maximize the probability of success. And those principles are reflected here. We have an extensive land assembly in the eastern Athabasca containing mineralized intercepts which have been inadequately followed up post-2011. And we looked for basement-style deposits in this prospective area that seem very limited basement deposit targeting. Our flagship property is Larock East, home to the Hurricane Zone. A few words on nuclear advocacy. When we speak about Canadian energy sector, most of us think about fossil fuels. The public generally has a good understanding of the juggernaut that is the fossil fuel sector, but many don't realize Canada is endowed with an enormous wealth of nuclear fuel waiting to be tapped. Two of the reasons why we're so interested in uranium are economics and the environment. Economically, these are incredibly rich deposits. We have grades up to 85% U3O8. 1 ton of that rock is worth about $56,000 US, and that ton occupies only 0.3 cubic meters. Environmentally, uranium is incredibly energy dense. Numbers are so large they are hard to visualize. And since we talk about gold equivalents for many metals and other commodities, we'd like to do something similar, but since uranium is an energy commodity, we'd like to talk about equivalent energy. We'll use equivalent oil because oil is the largest source of energy in the world and is well understood. The United States is the world's largest oil producer, producing approximately 12 million barrels of oil a day. That's 22,000 liters a second, and is sufficient to fill the world's largest tanker 4 times a day. That tanker is 380 meters long, can hold more than 3 million barrels, and the value of that cargo is worth about $193 million using the average 2020 oil price. Conversely, you could get the same amount of energy from about 69,000 pounds of natural uranium. That sounds like a lot, but it's only about 1.6 cubic meters, and that cube's only about 1.2 meters a side. At today's prices, that amount of uranium is worth only about $2.1 million. So in comparison, it would be fair to say that nuclear fuel is virtually insignificant in terms of volume and cost when compared to fossil fuels. In the context of British Columbia, there are some interesting statistics and comparisons we can make. So in 2017, BC consumed about 350 billion kilowatt hours of energy from all sources. That's about equivalent to 200 million barrels of oil, 65 supertanker loads worth. And if you were to build a tank to hold that amount of oil, and the footprint of the tank was the size of an NHL ice surface, the tank would have to be 21 kilometers tall. Zooming out so we can actually see the tank, you see those landmarks, the CN Tower and the Burj Khalifa, some of the largest structures in the world, virtually disappear next to this hypothetical tank. On the other hand, the same amount of energy could be produced from 4.4 million pounds of natural uranium, which again sounds like a lot, but that's only a fraction of a small deposit in the Athabasca, and volumetrically, it's only about 105 cubic meters. That boils down to a cube measuring about 4.7 meters on the side, and interestingly enough, that's less than half a tank of fuel for a 747 jumbo jet in terms of volume. So we've covered how dense uranium is in energy, but how rich in uranium is Canada? Well, I'd say we're very well endowed in uranium. The Arrow deposit, a single uranium deposit, albeit a substantial one, discovered and owned by NextGen Energy, contains about 350 million pounds of U3O8. It's about 23 trillion kilowatt hours in potential energy, which is equivalent to 3 years of US oil production, more than 4,000 supertanker loads, and if it were mined, processed, and fed through a CANDU nuclear reactor, which consumes natural uranium, not enriched uranium, it would produce sufficient power to provide British Columbia's 2017 energy needs for 22 years. Another way to say it will be the amount of energy in Arrow is equivalent to BC's wind turbines operating at 100% capacity for nearly 4,000 years. Moving on to the hurricane zone, this is a snapshot of the Loroc East project at the time of acquisition. It covers the northeast extension of the Loroc Trend, a northeast trending package of graphitic metasedimentary rocks hosting several significant showings. When we acquired the project in May 2018, there were 23 historical drill holes, 5 of which were weakly mineralized, located in the eastern end and the western end of the property, as well as the Loroc North showing was located just 400 meters west of the property boundary. Our first step, as is normally the case in an acquisition, is to QA/QC and interpret the data, followed by a review of the historical core in the field to verify those interpretations and get a first-hand feel for the property geology. On the left, we have a photo taken by our Vice President of Exploration, Steve Blower, during that core review, and it was taken about a month before the discovery. In the photo are Stephanie Laureat-Loziak and Justin Rodko. So in the course of the review, some standout walk-up drill-ready targets were identified, in particular the area around historical holes Kerr 11 and Kerr 12, which are the western weak mineralization intersections shown on the last slide. And although budgets and exploration plans had already been decided for the summer, it was decided to shift one hole from our adjacent Geiger property to Loroc East to follow up Kerr 11 and 12. And to illustrate the reasoning behind that decision, on the left we have a vertical section from the core review showing historical and proposed drill hole. The historical drill holes are showing, through the sandstone, uranium content in ppm by partial digestion. And gray and blue are values less than 0.5 ppm, which is background in this area of the basin, whereas red indicates values greater than 1 ppm, which is anomalous in this part of the basin. And you can see that the first hole on section, Kerr 12, intersected relatively cool geochemically sandstones until about 55 meters above the unconformity, at which point there's an abrupt change to anomalous values. In fact, that bottom 55 meters averaged 11 parts per million uranium, including 0.5 meters with more than 500 ppm. And that would get anyone's attention, and it certainly got the historical operators' attention when they came back a few years later and drilled Kerr 12 from the opposite direction. Now, Kerr 12 was a very interesting hole. It intersected widespread structure, illitic alteration, and anomalous geochemistry throughout the sandstone, and basement included sheared graphitic lithologies with significant reactivated structures and associated alteration. This was only 600 meters away from the Loroc Lake North uranium occurrence. When we looked at these results, we interpreted them to be a near miss and a likely overshot. So our strategy was fairly simple. We simply backed up and drilled a parallel hole 40 meters away. And shown on the right is the same section about 6 months later with the proposed hole, now at a real hole, LE1801A, or discovery hole, and the 2 historical holes highlighted now. And the end result is the discovery of the hurricane zone with LE1801A intersecting 1.3% U3O8 over 8.5 meters. Fast forward a few years, these are some of our most recent results and our best results to date in the photo. LE20-74, 7.5 meters, averaging 38.8% U3O8, including 3.5 meters, averaging 74% U3O8. Those are world-class hits. Those are very strong mineralization, and for the record, some exceptionally dense core. Also draw your attention to a few other results. One from the winter, LE20-34, which intersected 8.5 meters, averaging 33.9% U3O8, as well as LE20-64 from the summer drilling, 5 meters, averaging 48.8%, and 4 meters, including 4 meters, averaging 57.5% U3O8. Moving to a plan view at the unconformity, the same 3 drill holes were shown on that proposed section. As you can see, our main lithologies are graphitic and non-graphitic metasediments in the immediate vicinity of the zone. Our major structures are shown and are labeled HIJK on the left of on the plan view. Here's the same view with contour GT polygons to give a sense of the distribution of mineralization. Generally speaking, both grade and thickness increase to the west, and they are matched by increasing alteration in structure observed in both the sandstone and the basement. The key thing to take away is our mineralization is occurring on a major basement tapping fault system that's caused a ridge in the sub-Athabasca unconformity, and our major structures are shown. That ridge is generally located between the H and J faults. Move on to our type section and discovery section, 4560 East. Key takeaways here: the major faults are preferentially developed at the semi-peelite, graphitic peelite contacts, and our best intersections occur on that ridge at the unconformity. So when we talk about major faults, this is what we're talking about: multiple meters of cataclastic textured fault rocks. This is an example of our J fault. It's about 10 meters long in the core, translating to about a 7-meter true thickness. Moving on to alteration. When we talk about alteration, it's helpful to define where there is no alteration. And in the eastern Athabasca, for economic purposes, you can consider the sandstone unaltered where we see diagenetic hematite banding. That's represented by these purple areas. Here's an example of what we mean by diagenetic hematite banding. It's the last thing you want to see through the sandstone, but it's what is most commonly seen during exploration. Bleaching is the next alteration type we see as we move away from surface with increasing depth. This blue shell shows the moderately bleached area. So outside of the purple and outside of the blue would be more weakly bleached areas. Inside blue would be moderately bleached. This is a good example of what we had logged: a moderately bleached core. Most of the iron's been removed compared to that photo of the diagenetic hematite banded sandstone, and what iron is left is largely in the form of limonite. A little further down, we begin to see a silicified zone. At some deposits like McArthur River, there's whole-scale silicification of the sandstone. Ours is more subtle. We have druzy quartz lining fractures, and that grades up to silica-heeled fractures with millimeter scale silicified envelopes. It's a fairly minor feature, but it's something we see repeatedly at the hurricane zone. Here's an example of our silicification with a little bit of hematite. Overlapping, but centered lower, is a desilicified zone. It's similar volume to the silicified zone, and desilicification is strongly controlled by structure. Desilicification increases strongly in the vicinity of structure, and it's quite variable through the sandstone. Next, we see clay alteration. Moderate clay is difficult to show in a photo, but strong clay is the complete replacement of the sandstone, and that's what we see here. We have some limonitic wall rocks flanking completely 100% massive clay in between those limonitic wall rocks. Hydrothermal hematite is a good indicator that you're approaching the mineralized zone. Hydrothermal hematite we begin to see along structures, and then it becomes pervasive proximal to mineralization. And gray alteration is very proximal to mineralization. Gray alteration is a bit of a colloquialism from the Athabasca Basin, and it refers to finely disseminated sulfides which impart a gray coloration to the sandstone. There's an example of what gray alteration looks like, as well as mineralization. The red values written on the core box correspond to counts per second by handheld scintillometer. Background values are 100 to 200. You can see we have some here in the many thousands, including 45,000 in the bottom of the second box. And I love this photo because it shows the redox front that's so critical to the development of these Athabasca unconformity deposits. The top box contains oxidized and bleached hydrothermal hematite bearing sandstones, where there's a sharp transition to dark gray reduced sandstone bearing the mineralization itself. Geochemically speaking, the hurricane zone sits in a fairly broad anomalous geochemistry halo. Uranium forms the largest halo that's readily identified, and what we're showing here is polygonized partial uranium in ppm in the sandstone via color scheme where the upper limit is double the lower limit for each interval. What we're going to do is leave those polygons of uranium content in the sandstone on as we migrate through other analytes, now showing arsenic along the drill traces with the polygonized uranium in the background. Arsenic shows a similar distribution as uranium, but it's a little more confined, a little more spatially restricted compared to uranium. Boron forms a fairly prominent halo that's well defined. Boron's a great indicator of metamorphism in the sandstone, but less useful in the basement due to the presence of tourmaline. Again, tighter to mineralization than the previous analyte, cobalt shows a similar distribution to copper, lanthanum, moly, and nickel. As expected, there's very anomalous lead associated with the mineralization, around which there's an abrupt transition to background lead values, which extends to the medial sandstones, and then in the medial and upper sandstones we begin to see patchy and irregular anomalous values of lead. In terms of spectral clays, the background in this part of the basin is a dichitic signature. Hurricane centered in about a 200-meter halo of elevated illite values, as well as kaolinite, typically greater than 50% illite within that halo, frequently over 80%, and what we tend to see is where there's decreased illite. If we sum illite and kaolinite, we get values approaching 100. Moving on to mineralization styles, here's a great example of massive mineralization. This is exceptionally dense rock. We have specific gravities approaching 7. And interestingly, densities remain fairly constant to about 3%, whereupon density increases fairly steadily with increasing U3O8 grades to about 30%. Beyond 30%, density increases rapidly with increasing grade, and that's where we get those enormous densities in the 30 to 85% U3O8 range. Here's an example of worm rock mineralization style, and that's another Athabasca colloquialism, and it refers to inner growths of hematite, pitchblende, and clay that result in a texture reminiscent of worm casts. Here's a nice example of fracture-controlled mineralization from our discovery hole, flanked by very strong hydrothermal hematite. We see fracture-controlled mineralization commonly in the sandstone and occasionally in the basement. Sometimes we see mineralization infilling breccias, the matrix of the ground mass of breccias. And finally, there's a spectrum between whole-scale replacement of the matrix of the sandstone and the lower end disseminations of mineralization in the sandstone. The plan view shown of the western end of the hurricane zone, and the key takeaway here is that we have grades, thicknesses, and widths comparable to those in major deposits and mines in the basin. And next we'll jump to section 4435 East, our most productive section to date. Now there's a number of holes on this section with GT products greater than 80% meters. And what we like to show is that this mineralization is still open to the south, with the southernmost hole, LE20-69, having intersected a broad interval of mineralization hanging well to the J&K faults. In fact, this area around the J&K faults is virtually untested throughout the hurricane zone area, and we believe there's good potential to expand that to the south. Here's an image putting Hurricane in context with other Athabasca uranium deposits. It's notable that Hurricane is at shallower depth than existing and proposed mines in the eastern Athabasca, including Cigar Lake and McArthur River. Finally, a few words on the discovery potential in the remainder of the Lower Rockies property. It's worth noting that as we move east to that hinge area, the depth of the unconformity decreases. 325 meters to the unconformity in the vicinity of the hurricane zone decreases to only 155 meters by the eastern boundary near those historical weakly mineralized drill holes. And 155 meters is within the range of open pitting. Next, I'd like to draw your attention to the color grid. That's a resistivity slice from the upper basement, and what it's showing is that conductivity is increasing, resistivity is decreasing in the basement as we move to the east, which is suggestive that there are faulted graphitic metasediments there, the preferred host rock for Athabasca uranium deposits, both at the unconformity and in the basement. What's not shown is that there's a prominent sandstone resistivity lobe extending well up into the sandstone in the eastern half of that resistivity survey area, and that's highly suggestive that there's hydrothermal alteration of the sandstone. Note also there's very few drill holes in this area, and of the few drill holes, one of them has intersected anomalous geochemistry and alteration, which is comparable to that seen in the immediate vicinity of the hurricane zone. We're quite keen to get out there and follow that up. And finally, we're the only junior with a new high-grade uranium discovery in the Athabasca. Uranium equities have really taken off in the past 6 weeks. We believe we're on the forefront of a uranium bull market. Our team is experienced Athabasca explorers, and we have projects located proximal to existing mills, infrastructure, and human capital. Our share structure is tightly held and offers great leverage to investors. And in closing, thank you very much for watching, and to AME for hosting Roundup 2021, but especially to our fantastic field staff, contractors, and service providers.